For centuries, humanity looked at electricity as, well, kind of like a magical, inexplicable force, right? It was either the terrifying power of a lightning strike or just some cheap parlor trick used to lift feathers. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to dive right into the exact, fascinating moment when electricity completely shifted from being this wild mystery we just observed to becoming a tangible, physical material that we actually engineered.
Let's kick this journey off in the 1860s with a pretty deep philosophical question. If you predict something using only math, did you actually discover it? You see, long before there was any physical machine out there to detect them, the brilliant Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves using nothing but compact math equations. He calculated that changing electric currents would constantly send out these massive, invisible waves of energy right into the world. And honestly, his math was so insanely advanced that very few people at the time even had a clue what he was proposing.
So Maxwell wrote down this groundbreaking math, but the gap between theoretical numbers and physical reality was massive. It literally took decades for Heinrich Hertz in Germany and Oliver Lodge in England to actually create and capture these invisible waves using alternating currents and sparks. Picture this. Hertz is spending months in a pitch-black room, staring super intensely through a lens, basically just crossing his fingers, hoping to see a faint spark jump across a tiny wire ring. Meanwhile, Lodge accidentally creates these glowing patches of blue light along wires in his lab, physically proving the peaks and troughs of the wave. They took Maxwell's numbers and essentially wrestled them right into the physical world.
And this theoretical breakthrough, it triggered a huge shift in the timeline. Scientists finally stopped asking what electricity does and for the first time started asking what it actually is. Back in the 1850s, Heinrich Geissler made these beautiful glowing gas tubes, proving that current could flow right through thin air. Then later, William Crookes pumped out almost all that air to create near-vacuum cathode rays, giving us a visible, tangible beam of electricity. And finally, right at the dawn of the 20th century, physicist J.J. Thomson looked closely at those beams and unmasked the true culprit hiding inside them, the electron.
Nailing down the electron completely shattered the old ways of thinking. It proved, once and for all, that electricity wasn't just some magical, invisible fluid flowing through invisible pipes. No, it was a tangible flow of physical particles orbiting within atoms. Thomson figured out that these tiny negatively charged subatomic particles were literally the physical carriers of electricity. And once we realized that these particles could actually be stripped away from atoms and directed, boom, electricity officially became a physical material we could manipulate.
Moving on to Section 1, Shrinking for Power. Smaller is stronger.
So, that atomic realization kickstarted this totally counterintuitive era in engineering. I mean, usually, bigger means stronger, right? But with electricity, the absolute key was making our hardware incredibly small so we could control the flow of those tiny electrons. We progressed from these bulky, super fragile glass vacuum valves, which, let's be honest, were basically just hot, delicate light bulbs steering electrons, to using tiny, solid semiconductor crystals like silicon for precise radar during World War II. That then evolved into the transistor at Bell Labs, which amplified signals without all that bulky glass. And eventually, engineers figured out how to print entire complex networks of these microscopic components onto a single, solid piece of material, the microchip. As one of the experts from our source material pointed out, there's this really weird effect in electronics. The smaller the components get, the more reliable they actually become. It's an absolute win-win situation. To put this crazy scale into perspective, a single modern microchip can easily pack in around 4 billion microscopic transistors. Yes, 4 billion tiny switches, all working in perfect harmony on one little chip. They're just moving physical electrons around to process everything from sending a quick text message to launching a rocket into space. Or, hey, even rendering this very explainer on your screen right now. But, as you might guess, this microscopic engineering does come with a pretty heavy cost. When you try to force a literal river of physical electrons through a microscopic silicon channel, they constantly bump into the atoms of that material, and all that friction generates immense heat. In fact, if you were to just yank the cooling fan off a modern computer processor, the chip would literally cook itself and melt in a matter of seconds. This electrical resistance is a massive hurdle. It wastes up to 20% of all the electrical energy we generate globally. So finding materials with zero resistance, which we call superconductors, is basically the next great frontier we are desperately trying to conquer to stop all that energy waste.
Which brings us to Section 2, Forgotten Pioneers, Science versus Business.
Now, while all these technological leaps physically shaped our modern world, the history of who actually gets remembered reveals a pretty cutthroat reality. You see, the history of tech isn't always written by the most brilliant minds. It's very often written by the sharpest businessmen. Take Jagadish Chandra Bose, for example. He was this brilliant Indian scientist who perfectly figured out how to use semiconductor crystals to detect radio waves. But he was a pure scientist. He deeply believed knowledge should be completely free. When he traveled to England, he was absolutely appalled by the commercial frenzy around early radio tech. As his quote right here vividly shows, the devouring greed he witnessed completely alienated him from the whole business side of invention, and he initially refused to commercially protect his world-changing work because of it.
Comparing these two groups reveals a rather tragic historical irony. You've got pure scientists like Lodge and Bose who laid down all the foundational physics. And on the flip side, you have commercially minded men like Guglielmo Marconi who simply combined those earlier discoveries into marketable systems and, well, walked away with a Nobel Prize. Marconi essentially took the exact wave detectors that Lodge and Bose had perfected, shoved them into a sealed black box, patented the entire system, and built an empire. Thomas Edison did something very similar with the incandescent light bulb and direct current. He didn't invent the light bulb from scratch, but he patented it, and he built the power grid system required to actually make it profitable.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a pretty provocative question. In the grand story of human innovation, does history truly reward the brilliant minds who discover reality, or merely the strategic hands who package it for profit? It's a question that really challenges us to look beyond just the famous names printed in our textbooks. Thank you so much for joining me today. And the next time you pick up your phone, just take a second to remember the forgotten pioneers who cracked the code of the universe to actually make it possible.